Boy, do I have a show for you today. So, today we're going to be responding to a TikTok that went viral that expresses what many people are feeling today. Hi, I'm Britt Hartley. I'm an atheist spiritual director and I focus on nihilism recovery. So, I'm going to go show you this TikTok now.
But I have it in a way that fuels a hatred for humanity rather than for myself. I don't find pleasure in any aspect of life because I see it being so bleak and pointless. I feel like I became aware of a game and I don't know how to play anymore. And I'm aware that therapy helps, but what's the point? Everything about existence has always felt like a giant distraction from the end, which is death, and it also feels like a giant distraction from all the horrors that is the daily life. I don't find pleasure in cooking or self-care or even really the fun things, because I know deep down that everything is going to end and none of it really matters. I feel like I'm unable to immerse myself into these emotions that I once felt and held dearly. I feel like I've grown a deep resentment for human life and every aspect of humanity and what makes people human. And I have no idea if it's because of the media I consume, the house I live in, the people I'm with, the friends I have, the economy. But it feels like this type of depression is not something that you can get out of. It feels like something you have to ignore forever. You have to make the active choice to play in the game if you want to have any fun. And it's not fun at all anymore. Is there a solution, or is this like permanent? Like, I'm actually genuinely asking.
My entire YouTube channel is dedicated to how to create a life of meaning in a meaningless universe. But what I want to do today is create like a crash course of the fastest way to get from point A, which is I feel like this girl all the time, to point B, which is I'm really glad that I get to experience existence and my life has meaning even if the universe didn't give it to me. What's the fastest way to get from point A to point B if we look at the data on how people go through this process? So this would be like the crash course of if this girl was my client and we were going to go into these existential questions of life being meaningful. So the first thing that we would do is just create a non-judgmental space to say these things without someone automatically thinking that you're crazy. The thing about existential depression is that it's not irrational. In fact, it can be highly rational. Some forms of mental illness or even like clinical depression can be irrational, like you truly aren't seeing things clearly. But existential depression is different. You can go there even when you're of sound mind with no history of depression by just truly rationally considering this project of life and whether or not it can be justified. So the first step is actually validating that what you feel isn't irrational and it doesn't make you crazy, and to just meet them there. No one understood in my life when I was going through it that I'm not just sad because like I need more sunshine. I'm wrestling with deep questions about the nature of existence, and I just needed someone to understand me and to take those questions seriously instead of just like brush them off. And at the time, I had no one. I was truly isolated. And then it gives you this Truman Show type feeling where you feel like you're awake asking these questions in a world that's like fake and constructed and everyone is acting. And that's when you start to kind of feel a little crazy, which is why so many people find solace in philosophers like Albert Camus, because he, for me, and a lot of people, was the first person to take me seriously, even though he's dead. Because in his books, he would say things like, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? Or he says, suicide is the first question of philosophy. It's whether or not you consent to life, and everything else comes after that question. And for many people, like his honesty and how he meets people in that place of just taking that question seriously and rationally even, and not just calling you crazy, is just emotionally validating. And then you can read more about why he thinks it's a good idea to consent to life. So it's helpful when you have someone more than just a dead philosopher here and there to meet you in that place and not get instantly defensive, because people are very scared of these kinds of questions. They're overwhelming. They don't want to think about it. And so they will put up a wall, not only against like your questions, but even you as a person, because subconsciously they know that there's something about you that is scary. And so people will just be very defensive. And then it means that you're asking these questions alone with maybe a dead philosopher or two. So that's the first. Let's just lay this all out. Give it to me. Give me all the feelings in a very non-judgmental space. Second, I'm going to, again, this is like a crash course. I could spend hours on any one of these things, but I'm going to give you 9 kind of steps that we see as as looking at the data, the fastest way to go to A from A to B. So second, don't freak out, psilocybin. Stay with me. I'm going to give you a lot of reasons why and even more caveats. If you want to talk about the data on how to give your brain, your nervous system, your thought spirals, your depression a reset, psilocybin statistically is going to help you the most, because part of the problem is if your nihilism is, or your existential depression is significant enough, you probably now also have symptoms of just clinical depression. And that means I could throw a dozen tools at you: journaling, philosophy, movement, connection, but you might not have the energy to pick any of them up or the hope that they will work. You also may not have the neuroplasticity for any of these tools or shifts in perspective to stick, because you're stuck in your thought loops. And you won't have the motivation to even try, because you don't even remember anymore what it feels like to just be the way that you were when you were a kid, where you didn't have to go outside and think about meaninglessness. You just kind of went outside and hopefully played. Hopefully you had a childhood like that. And so psilocybin specifically, and maybe secondarily ketamine, can give you that reset. So it's doing a couple things for us. It's helping you emotionally process how you got here. And a lot of people cry out a lot in these sessions because they can feel these emotions finally and really grieve and then process them out of their body and then move on. The reason that psilocybin helps with depression, OCD, PTSD, and addiction, for all four, it is the best tool that we have, is because it helps you rise out of your thought loops that you're stuck in, because all four of these are thought loops. And then you get to stand on new ground for a second and see from another perspective. And then with integration therapy with it, you're able to then use that neuroplasticity to move forward into a new perspective, which is why it's, the best for PTSD and OCD and addiction and depression. So, and the results are crazy. I mean, it's like 80% of smokers who do one large dose of psilocybin do not pick up smoking right after, and they're just like done with smoking. For PTSD, the numbers are like 70% will experience no severe PTSD symptoms after a large dose. For depression, it's more like 60%. But we are not getting anything that is giving us these kinds of numbers. And so let me just tell you about my first experience. So it took me 2 years from the time that I decided that I wanted to do this by reading Michael Pollan, and I decided that I wanted to do it with a guide that I trusted, which I recommend for everyone. It cost me one afternoon and $10. Like, the product itself was not very expensive. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I did when I was a child, which was happy and curious in all directions. And it was very fun. And I was asking my guide, like, I remember asking her to ask me to spell things, because I was just playing in my brain, like, what's still here and what's not. And I could still spell things. I still had really good spelling. But then I'd ask her, like, ask me some history questions, because I used to be a history teacher. And she said, what's in the Declaration of Independence? And I went into my brain where the Declaration of Independence should be, and I have it memorized, and I couldn't remember it. And so I was just playing. It was just very playful. And then after a while, and this can be common, where it can be light and silly and then get really heavy. And then after a while, as I was coming out of it, it was like growing up in the space of 10 minutes. So it was like, when I was happy and curious as a child, I figured that there was truth and God and goodness and all these things that I assumed about the world. And then as I grew up and kept asking questions, I learned answers that I didn't want or I didn't like. And so I felt like I was drowning in kind of the effects of my curiosity, which is all the things that I'd learned that had hurt me. And then I got to grieve that finally. And so I just collapsed, and my guide held me, and she's amazing. And she was kind of this like divine feminine presence. And she just held me while I did these deep, deep body sobs as I sobbed out how painful it was to learn what the world is and how different it is compared to what I thought the world was when I was a child. So it was really hard. It was really heavy. I was emotionally exhausted. But the next day I texted her and I said, I feel like sunshine in my brain, which is really strange for me. I've had depression since puberty, and it kind of like waxes and wanes, but it's just been something that's always been there for me. But I finally felt some energy, and I felt a reset, and I felt like I could take a breath. And I felt like I could feel again, when your feelings are just kind of cut off, because I was super dissociated. I was very, very depressed and dissociated when I did it. And I didn't feel dissociated anymore. I could feel again. And it just gave me the energy and the reset I needed to move forward. And it just kind of gave me a jump start. Now, do you have to do this? No. If you have psychosis in your family, schizophrenia, this may not be the tool for you. Also, if you have no way of accessing this, it doesn't mean that you just need to give up. Or if you have a job where you can't mess around with this stuff, it doesn't mean that you can't move forward. Anywhere that you can access on drugs, you can access without them. It just may take a little longer to get your body and brain reset so that you have the energy and the flexibility and the motivation to do some rebuilding, rather than just the tendency to take a gummy and numb out. And again, it's not like these later tools I mentioned won't work. It's just that statistically, they're going to work faster in conjunction with psychedelics, specifically psilocybin. And according to the data, it's about in between 3 and 4 grams is kind of where we're looking at for a first timer with a guide, and with integration therapy the day after, when your brain is still really squishy. It seems like microdosing doesn't seem to have the same level of effect for depression. Now, other psychedelics that people use, MDMA can be helpful for people who in their nihilism have a hatred of humanity. It can help with that aspect. So I usually only recommend that one if severe isolation or even disdain for humanity is a problem. DMT isn't usually recommended for people in existential crisis. It's this brief, overwhelming immersion into a different kind of consciousness where your ego dissolves almost instantly. And it's really fast. It's only like 10 or 20, it's like 10 minutes. And this can be profound, but it's very destabilizing, because you're really just like jumping in and jumping out without a lot of time to be able to process what's happening. So it's usually not recommended for first-time users or people in psychologically fragile states, unlike psilocybin, which will kind of open up your emotional body. DMT is like being catapulted into a different reality and then like being catapulted back out of it with no time to orient or make sense of it. So for that reason, it's usually not recommended for someone in existential depression. Ayahuasca can be helpful for people, but it's generally considered too intense for this kind of therapy that we're wanting. You throw up a lot, you purge. It's really, really long. It can feel like you spend lifetimes out there. It's kind of just drinking out of a fire hose. And so it's usually not something that we're wanting for people who feel like they're on the edge. And then for LSD, that will give you a longer, more stimulating, often more visual experience that can, the reason that it's not recommended is it can lead to mental loops, or it can intensify spiraling. So again, I'm just going off the data. It's usually not recommended for the kind of existential depression that we're trying to work with in conjunction with other tools. So I personally don't drink alcohol. I don't do any of these other drugs that I've mentioned, but for my own mental health, I use psilocybin about once a year, sometimes twice if if I'm having a rough time for my mental health. It isn't fun for me. It's not a high. I always cry. I always have a hard time. It's hard on my body too, even with things that you can do with citrus. It's really hard on my stomach. I usually don't eat for like 24 hours afterwards. It's not fun. It's not a party for me. But I learn a lot and I process a lot, and my depression stays at bay so that I don't have to be on SSRIs. So I haven't felt the need to do any of these other drugs, because the goal with this stuff is to use it less and less until ideally you don't need to use it at all. And for me, this has been the cheapest, most effective depression treatment, as I've had depression since puberty. And it absolutely did help me move forward when I was in the dark place of what is the point, I wish I was never born kind of stuff. So the first step, if I was working with her and I just had all the time in the world just to focus on her. I'd sit with her. I'd let her say all the things she needs to say, all the things about the universe she learned that were different than her expectations as a child. We would mourn. We would cry. I wouldn't fix it. I would just meet her there, because this is a kind of existential grief that is rational. It's not irrational. And then, under a guide, try to use mushrooms as a way to process that grief. Remember that there are other ways to be, so that we can learn how to inhabit that with our sober mind. But it will give you motivation that other states of being exists. It will reset motivation. Especially if you're feeling anhedonic, where you've lost your sense of feeling at all. If your depression is so bad that you can no longer feel, or you're dissociated, it can reset that. And then it gives us also some ability to change perspectives really quickly, because we have some neuroplasticity, we have a little energy, and we have a new way of looking at things. So it's just going to speed up the process. If that's not available, I'd look into possibly ketamine therapy, SSRIs with a long-term plan to taper, breath work, EMDR, somatic work, trauma work, dance. Dance surprisingly shows up as a way to reset the nervous system, which is interesting because so many mystical traditions include dance, like the whirling dervish for Sufis. So, before anything deep can land, the nervous system must be regulated enough to engage. And if the person is in a depressive state, suicidal ideation, complete shutdown, dissociated, the first move is biology, not meaning making, not philosophy. We need your body on board here. The goal is enough clarity, stability, neuroplasticity to begin doing internal work, so that you're safe enough to go into that, motivated enough to go into that, awake enough to get into that. We're essentially giving you your best shot by giving you a brain and body that are at least functioning, if not at its best, then at least not at its worst. And if this is hard to hear, I hated this, because I'm an overthinker. I'm a headspace person, and I didn't like to think that my um, views of the world would change based on like a walk and sunshine and dance and healthy food. Like, what does that have to do with my philosophical problems? But the answer, for me included, is actually quite a bit. As rational as you think you are, your brain is a part of the system. And if that system isn't functioning, how are you going to be able to possibly see things from a new perspective? No one is that much of a rational brain disconnected from a body. So even if you don't believe it will help, we start with the body to give you your best shot at changes and shifts that will make your life better. I'm going to have to move more quickly because I promised a crash course and I'm already talking too much. So, step 3, evaluate your past. And this will help you to be able to move forward quicker if we understand where your story broke down. So we can't write a new story until we know where your old story broke down. This could be journaling, online groups, IFS, where you see your story as part of a family story, deconstructing religion and understanding that aspect, if that's part of your story, really just narrowing down, like, where did this break down for you? At what age did you become disillusioned, and why? And for some people that I meet, it's like 9 years old. Sometimes it's like after this breakup. Sometimes it's when I lost religion. Sometimes it's like when I'm getting burned out from my job and like feeling like capitalism is taking my joy for life. Until you've named that story and named the grief and deaths that happened along the way, we can't move forward. So step 3 is just like, let's understand the story that got us here and do some work to really put that into words. Step 4 is where we introduce some basic existential therapy. This is where we introduce the shift that the universe doesn't give you meaning, you create it, even in the midst of a suffering world. This is where we bring in Viktor Frankl, that people learned how to do this even when they had less freedom than you do now in concentration camps. This is where we introduce the pivotal shift that the universe doesn't give you meaning, you create it. And so this is basically the core of existential therapy. It's not about fixing your brain or explaining away your sadness. It's not really even about like the neurochemical situation in your brain. It's about facing reality with clear eyes and learning how to respond. Because existential therapy takes your anxiety and your depression seriously, not as a problem to medicate away, but as a signal that you're awake to the human condition, that you get it, that life is fragile and uncertain and unfair and short and requires apparently a lot of suffering. And that's exactly why existential therapy matters. We pull in people like Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and came out the other side with an understanding that those who have a why can live to bear almost any how. But we don't stop with Frankl. Existential therapy today is grounded in understanding the 4 existential fears, which I talk about a lot on this channel. 1, death, we're going to die, and that has to become your catalyst for how you want to live. Freedom, you are radically free to choose, which is both exhilarating and terrifying. 3, isolation, you are ultimately alone in your inner world. No one really knows what it's like to be you, and then how we meet that. And then meaninglessness, that the universe doesn't hand you a script, you have to write one. So rather than run from those things or find some kind of story or delusion, we actually get existential therapy to learn how to lean into these things. And it invites you to stop looking for guarantees and stop waiting for society to fix itself, and begin to ask yourself, given the absurdity of life, what would I still choose? What would I create anyway? What's worth experiencing? What's worth standing for? What's worth standing against? How can my pain become something beautiful? And this is where you start to take agency, not in like a hustle culture kind of way, but in a quiet kind of bravery. You begin to choose values and meaning, not because the universe cares, but because you do. And so you realize that you can make your life artful and ethical and full of wonder, not in spite of life's uncertainty, but because of it. And so existential therapy helps move you to the point from what's the point to what kind of point would I be proud to make in this absurd situation that I'm in. And this is not surface level optimism. In fact, in these tough situations like concentration camps and prisoner of war situations, we knew that the optimists were often the first to die, because they would say like, oh, I'm getting out soon, and then they didn't. And then when their story of optimism hit reality, they had nothing, and they would have give up itis and roll over and die. So this is deeper than happiness. It's existential resilience. You don't need to have all the answers, but it just gives you tools and agency for building a life worth experiencing, even if it ends, and even if we have to face reality as it is. So we would only introduce these concepts here, that this is the shift that we're going into. But for the next part, if you want to create a life that is so unique that only you can live it, you have to actually know who you are, which is why here we only do an introduction, because to dive into this, we first have to know who you are, which brings us to step 5. Who are you? Every single philosopher, every single TED talker, every single person like me who talks about surviving the void and coming out the other side will talk about some form of living an authentic life. It's the only way that life is worth living. And so once you've confronted the reality that there's no cosmic blueprint, or even accepting that life on earth is a lot of needless suffering, the only question that remains is, what kind of life feels real to you, and what story would be worth telling anyways? And this doesn't mean crafting a life that looks good or sounds noble on paper. It means creating a life that feels aligned on the inside. So Simone de Beauvoir pushed this further by exploring that systems and other people complicate our ability to live authentically. And she warned that inauthenticity creeps in whenever we try to live to satisfy external expectations rather than internal truth and internal what things are inherently meaningful to you. And so the part of this work isn't just like who I am, but also separating it from who told me who I had to be. And that's why this step is very personal. It's not writing affirmations or making a vision board. It's pulling apart the stories that you inherited and slowly discovering which parts are yours. It's about noticing what stirs your heart when no one's watching. What do you do when you're not trying to impress or escape? What values feel true to you that you'd want to live them even if no one gave you a gold star for doing so, even if you die in the process? What's worth witnessing? And this is the part where we might look into tools of personality and motivation. I prefer the Enneagram because it's not action based or like what you do, it's motivation based. I think that helps a lot with self-discovery. For anyone who's into that, I'm a 4 wing 5, which would instantly make sense to you if you understand the Enneagram. I find it very helpful. I would also recommend in this phase shadow work, which is meeting the part of you that you're most afraid of and integrating that part of you, or most afraid of other people finding out about the part of you that you're most ashamed of. Inner child work, meeting all your previous selves and integrating them. What did they have to say? What did they needed to hear? What did they need to hear? I do a full course on that too. IFS, internal family systems, can be again good here for discovering what parts of you exist because of your family dynamic. Journaling, fine. Identity mapping, fine. Big Five personality tests can be helpful. Jungian archetype work or mythology, if you're more story or symbolism oriented. I'm a big fan of that. None of these I would consider magical. I wouldn't even maybe even consider them hard science. They're just tools. These are just mirrors. We're just trying to find some mirrors and some language to learn who we are underneath who we were conditioned to be. And I would say at the lowest of this list, like stay away from maybe like human design. I would also say astrology, because you just have to wade through a lot of BS in order to get anything useful. So there are some I think that are better than others, but essentially we just need some mirrors to try to figure out who you are. And this right here is where so many people get stuck in their existential depression, because they'll get to the disillusionment and then they sit on the couch and wait for society to fix itself. And I'll be honest, it kind of bugs me sometimes that the people who whine sometimes the most about capitalism are the ones on the couch waiting for society to fix itself and become a community where people lay around all day and make art. But because the power structures won't create that for them, which would feel very safe if someone else created it for you, then you just end up on the couch having an edible, turning on Netflix, and buying stupid stuff that you don't need on Amazon. And I get annoyed by that, because if you could just use that feeling as a catalyst for what kind of life is worth living, how do I create the kind of community that I would want to be a part of? How is capitalism built on human nature? How much of that still exists within me? Those kinds of questions, once you use these feelings as a catalyst, that's when I see people create the most beautiful, unique, meaningful lives that cut against the grain of society. But if you are going to wait around and wait for society to fix it for you, because you don't want to cut against the grain, you're going to die waiting. And that's what's so sad. And so the gem of existential depression is, I'm suffering so much and I'm realizing that I'm going to die. What am I holding on to here? What do I have left to lose? I'm willing to do anything because I have nothing left to lose. What is that Elaine quote where she says, "What am I holding on?" Oh, she goes, "I'm at a cockfight at 2 a.m. What am I holding on to?" I love that quote. It's basically this place of like, what am I holding on to here? Why am I too scared to try something when I'm already suffering so much? So that rock bottom place is a place where often big changes happen because we stop waiting for society to fix itself and just give us the life that we would want. It's never going to do that. Which then leads into step 6, which is risks into authenticity. Once you've started identifying your values, the next step is learning how to live them, especially in a world that punishes authenticity and rewards conformity. So taking risks into authenticity is a kind of muscle. Neurotypical people, we have brains that go with the flow of the group by nature, which is sometimes absurd to neurodiverse people. We didn't choose that. It's just what our brains do. For if you have a neurotypical brain, you just go with the flow of society. So if you're not happy with the life that society gave you, you're going to have to rock the boat, and that's going to feel uncomfortable. But again, if you can push through it because you're already suffering, then it can be the push that you need to do uncomfortable things. I will say this: if you cannot say something weird in an elevator, like walk into an elevator and say, "Life is pretty absurd, isn't it?" and just sit there for 10 seconds. And if you can't do that yet, your muscles aren't strong enough to build an authentic life, because your muscles aren't quite ready to cut against the grain of social norms. This is where I like to introduce the term anarchy calisthenics, which was termed by a political scientist named James C. Scott. And this concept refers to small, everyday acts of resistance that help you build the muscle of nonconformity. And these are not like grand gestures or revolutions. They're just quiet ways and like non-destructive ways often of practicing your freedom, so that when it matters, you've built up your muscles strong enough to stand your ground. So that could be like sometimes saying something weird on an elevator, or I know that there's like psychology professors that will have their students like walk backwards into an elevator just to see how that feels. And it's just a reminder that you don't have to play by invisible scripts. It keeps you awake. And it could be telling the truth in a moment where silence would be easier. But these small rebellions, even though they seem insignificant, serve a deeper purpose. They train you to live deliberately rather than automatically. And in a culture that encourages numbness and obedience and distraction, that kind of self-possession, that kind of deliberation is revolutionary. So one of the first things that I did when I realized, when I was kind of doing this inner work and learning about myself, is that I fundamentally don't care about clothing or fashion or food variety. Like in my ideal world, everyone would wear the same thing every day because nobody cares, or we'd all be naked. I really don't care. And food would just kind of like healthy, ethical food would just kind of like pop up on the table if I have to eat, and then we could go back to discussing ideas. That would be an ideal world for me. It is a chore for me. I don't enjoy it. I'm not saying it's bad. For some people, that is a reminder of their values to dress in an authentic way. For me, I cannot get myself to give a shit. So, one of my first acts of defiance was to reduce my wardrobe to one box. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it gave me a tiny little bit more money and a tiny bit more time and a tiny bit more deliberate action over expectation. And those small risks built up that muscle until I could take a big risk, like opening up TikTok and saying, "Hi, I'm an atheist spiritual director. Here's what I'm thinking about today." Even though both atheists and religious people think that that's absurd. But that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to help people with the good life without depending on the supernatural. And I took a big leap to do that. Everything good in my life now is something that I took a big leap to do or to work at. Everything good in my life now is because I deliberately chose it, even if I failed at it at first, because I kept going because it mattered to me. And then my life changed from top to bottom, from what I wear to the simple meals that I make because I don't care about spending an hour cooking, to my relationships, investing some time in investing more in some relationships and less in others, and cutting off some people entirely, to my work, to what I do in a day, everything. And so, even though I didn't expect that this experiment was going to work for me, I decided I was going to try because I had nothing to lose. And I was surprised that 1 year later, I woke up one day and had the most strange feeling that I hadn't had in years, which was, I don't want to die. And I was looking forward to experiencing that day because of how I had built it top to bottom. And so that's why I help people when they're stuck, is because if you can keep pushing through, the other side is a more authentic life than society ever could have given you, which leads to step 7, how to keep that going. So step 7 is wisdom cultivation. Once you've taken those first risks towards authenticity and you kind of have a sense of who you are, and you start really leaning in towards what's a life worth living and all of that, and building in your meaning, that kind of thing. The question becomes, how do I stay rooted in that life, especially when the world is always trying to pull me back into numbness or conformity, or the rat race or whatever it is. And this is where wisdom cultivation becomes really important. And I want to be clear that wisdom is not the same as intelligence. I don't claim to know. I really don't make any big claims about the universe. I really don't know far more than I know. Wisdom is not the same as intelligence. It's not the same as knowing more facts or reading more books. It's lived experience. It's earned. It's the integration of your suffering, your insights, your failures, your compassion, your clarity. It's how you orient yourself to move in the world. And so you need some way to help you with that orientation. So for some people, it's something like stoicism, which I actually do recommend. I would add some feminine spirituality to that, just because often it's lacking on the feminine side of things. Absurdism is a really popular one. Optimistic nihilism, existentialism, secular Buddhism, Alain de Botton's School of Life, John Vervaeke and the Meaning Crisis, Taoism, Jungian psychology, feminist spirituality, utilitarianism, I see all of these in my work as scaffolds that help people with existential crisis, because these are tools that don't require a lot of like faith or belief in anything. They're just tools. Even, and I hate saying this and you're going to hate hearing it, but even Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, even if you hate JP for all of his wild takes and his political and religious stances, there are people in nihilism who claim that that book and living their life according to the rules of that structure helped them. I'm just going with the data here. So essentially just anything that isn't too woo and delusional, because if you have a high BS meter, it's not going to work, but gives you some tools and structure and stories and narratives and heroes, people who have been where you are and gotten through it, ways of thinking. This will help your make this your way of life, make this your operating system. Otherwise, you're going to slip back into old patterns of thinking, especially when you're like around your family and you slip into an older version of yourself. This is going to probably happen to me next week as I go to a family reunion with my family, and I just instantly jump into my oldest daughter mode, and I kind of forget what I'm doing sometimes because I just go into what I'm expected to be, essentially. So a lot of this doesn't cost any money. It's just deciding like, hey, stoicism is really speaking to me lately. I'm going to dive into that for a year. I'm going to follow Ryan Holiday on social media. I'm going to listen to podcasts about stoicism. All of these isms, and I've taken tools from every single one, have a YouTube video or a podcast dedicated to just that thing. And so having just like a flow of wisdom in my life from these more grounded philosophies helped me to stay in that state of radical authenticity and existential courage. And then you have a lower failure rate because it's not just me recreating my life, like recreating the wheel every step of the way. It's also learning from thousands of other people who have navigated this, who I can benefit from their lives too, and the wheels that they've created. Which then brings me to my next step, which is rituals. I'm almost done, I promise. Rituals are the anchors that help bring the meaning into your nervous system. So after all these insights and the grief work and the self-discovery and the philosophical shifts, you still like wake up on a Monday, and the meaning is not going to sustain itself until it's embedded in how you live. This is why religions are so good at this. When I was Mormon, I would wake up every morning and I would say a prayer and I would read scriptures multiple times a week. I was going to church. I was hearing stories about Mormon heroes. I was Monday night was family night. Wednesday night, you take your kids to the church. Sunday, you go to church. Then you have holidays and you have a liturgical calendar and you have pictures on the wall and you have things that you say. And it really is like, if you want to remember the Mormon story of their concept of the purpose of life, which is a little crazy, but it's it at least gives you some kind of framework for life. They're constantly reminding you of that framework, and it is embedded into your life in such a way that it just becomes your way of life. And you essentially have to build that for you. So rituals don't have to be sacred. They don't have to be elaborate. They just have to be really intentional. So a cup of tea, in a cup that your grandma made in silence before the chaos starts, a walk every Sunday to reset, a weekly journaling practice to track who you're becoming, a playlist that marks your transition from survival mode to intentionality. These are signals to your own mind that of what journey you're on and what you want to be. So thinkers like Mircea Eliade, who is a religious scholar, and Carl Jung emphasize that ritual, it's not superstitious, it's a container. This is creating the space for your transformation, and it's protecting and reminding you of your values so that you don't get drowned out by the noise of the world. And so in a universe that doesn't hand you meaning, rituals become your scaffolding. They're how you live out your philosophy in the everyday and how you embed it into your life. So without ritual, the wisdom stays in your head. With ritual, it becomes your way of being. So I say memento mori every morning when I wake up. I read a book to my kids every Sunday morning where we do a little like moral education lesson. We say a little quote before a meal. I have daily, weekly, yearly things, and they're very short things. Most of them take no longer than 10 seconds because I'm a busy mom, that just infuse my life and inspires me and focuses me on what I am living for. And if you look at my wall over here, the lighting is bad, But these are all pictures that remind me of things. And I put them, around. And people will do this with secular altars. Like they'll have a desk where they put in little trinkets from places they've traveled and quotes that just stir their heart. And, I have my little rock guy from Everything Everywhere All at Once that a friend gave me, and put those things around you the same way that religious people do. And it actually helps you create intentionally your life and remind you of that life. And so let's go to my last step here, which is step 9, which is lose yourself. The point of doing all this self exploration work is to know where to plug in, where to lose yourself in something bigger than you, even if it's a losing battle. I don't believe secular spirituality is going to defeat religion. I don't. I show up anyway because even if one person gains the skills to leave religion and live an authentic, thriving life outside of it, that still matters to me. That intrinsically matters to me because I remember being there outside of Mormonism and outside of my family without a resource or without a friend in the world. And so here's the deeper truth. You can only carry the weight of your own life for so long before it folds in on itself. Meaning expands when you give it away. And so when you turn your pain into service, when you use what you've learned to lessen someone else's suffering, this is existential survival. This is transcendent purpose. This is what Buddhists call a compassionate action. Whatever you call it, Jesus called it becoming like a little child and learning how to lose yourself. He who loses himself will find, he who loses his life will find it, is what Jesus says about it. And there's something that mystics speak of over and over about this concept of finding a place to lose yourself. That does not mean disappearing. It means being free enough to stop obsessing over your identity and start contributing in places that you care about. It might look like mentoring someone or building something that didn't exist before, or raising a child, or adopting a dog, or writing a book, or simply choosing to be a kind presence in someone's life. You don't have to change the entire world. You just have to choose that in your corner of it, this matters. I'm going to be here doing this, even if it's hard, even if it fails, even if it doesn't win. That's the final move from despair to dignity, from drifting to grounded, from nihilism to meaning. And so where I see people give up is they think, oh, I have to change every aspect of the world in order to be okay. That's like kicking the dog in front of you just because you can't save all the dogs. Maybe you can't. But it's absurd to think that you don't matter just because you can only help 2 shelter dogs. To those two dogs, you matter more than anything. And so what most people don't know about Maslow is that in his later years, he revised his famous hierarchy. And we've seen this a million times. You've seen this in like basic psychology. Even in high school, they will teach like this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? But in his later life, he realized that he used to put at the top self-actualization, which is someone like living according to their own goals. And before he died, he never got a chance to publish it, but we know in his papers before he died, he was working on something that he found above self-actualization, which he called self-transcendence. It's these people that he found that were doing the work of healing and stable. It's people that he found that had done the work of understanding themselves and living authentically and setting their goals, but they were now kind of living beyond themselves. So Maslow observed that the happiest, most fulfilled people were not the ones who were just endlessly working on themselves to the point that it almost becomes narcissistic, but the ones who had moved through their own transformation and then turned outward with love, with creativity, with service. And these were the ones who had discovered what he called being values: truth, beauty, justice, simplicity, unity. They were not just abstract ideals, but they were the way these people showed up in the world. So past self-actualization, he believed that there were people that became, these amazing people in their own personal journey, and then learned how to give it all away freely, right? Freely, and happy to give it away. And we see that from a lot of mystic statements too. So in a 9 steps crash course, number 1, find a non-judgmental space to say the thing out loud. To me in an email, to ChatGPT, Ask it, if you're going to use ChatGPT, ask it specifically to be an existential therapist. So, and ask it not to feed into any delusions. Put your own guardrails on it to make sure that it's not going to coddle you into some delusion. Talk to a friend, to a Reddit thread, something. Number 2, get your body on board. Mushrooms, dance, body work, healthy habits, sleep, SSRIs, sunshine, a walk, food, something. All of those things are great. Pick one. Third, write out your story and where especially your story took a turn towards existential depression, and try to understand what happened to you. Fourth, listen to free YouTube videos or this channel, or pick up a book on existential philosophy and the idea of creating your own life of meaning. Fifth, do some inner exploration with the tools that I've mentioned. Again, library books, YouTube videos, Enneagram tests, all these things are free. Number 6, start making small, authentic choices of risk. You're already suffering. You have nothing to lose. You may as well try. You don't even have to believe that it will work. Just try strengthening that muscle. Number 7, find some kind of ism or framework that's resonating with you, and make a little rule with yourself that maybe you have to listen to a TED Talk for one of your car ride commutes, or before you turn on trash TV or whatever. That's something that I do. I watch a lot of trash TV. I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by anything human psychology, but I will try to listen to a TED Talk or something inspirational before I spend the rest of the night watching trash television. Number 8, develop some rituals that bring this approach to life into your way of being. The same thing religious people do. Start decorating your house and building into your life the things that are going to remind you about your approach to life and what you're wanting to do with your life, the stories that inspire you, that kind of thing. And then number 9, lose yourself into something bigger than you. This is the end game. This is how people go from what's the point to I'm glad I get to exist. Because when you lose yourself into something worthy, you find the part of yourself that was never lost to begin with. Most of you, I think, wouldn't look at my life now where I help hundreds, I don't know, maybe even thousands of people go through this process. I sit with them in their darkest spaces. I think most of you would not look at my life and say that is a meaningless life. You can maybe see something in my life worth doing, or maybe of value, but I promise you 5 years ago, I was just like this girl that I showed at the beginning. I was depressed, I was suicidal, I was dissociated, I had no friends, I had no meaning, I pretended all day long, I was completely numb, I had no marketable skills, I had a worthless theology degree, and I didn't believe in God anymore. All of my relationships were shallow, I had nothing, and life sucked. But this move that you can make to turn pain into a catalyst for what a life worth living would be like, and how nihilism or existential depression kind of forces you to have that kind of honest conversation with yourself for the first time, and even the courage to enact it. I changed every part of my life from the ground up, even in capitalism, even in Trumpland, Idaho, where I live, even with no one and nothing. And this is how everyone's story is when they decide to radically create their own life. You hear those voices everywhere. In the business world, it's Gary Vee. It's, you hear stories like this, and why not you? They all started in that dark place, in that black hole too. But if you can do that catalyzation process, then it changes into a very unique, intentional, authentic life. So I really do hope that this has helped. Even if it doesn't, it's part of my own meaning and purpose to put it out there in the world anyway, even if it never gets any views at all, because I remember being there. And if someone could have held my hand when I was at my worst, it would have been priceless to me. It would have been invaluable to me. So even if this video is just for one other person, it was worth doing for me, because I remember being there, and being there for someone else is intrinsically valuable for me. So I hope that that person's you, and I hope that it helped. Next week, I'll be doing a follow-up to this video, which is the kinds of depression that people experience, the flavors, if you will, of depression, and then the most helpful tools for each kind, so that hopefully you can kind of, especially if you don't maybe have access to a therapist, you can hopefully cobble together a plan that will help you meet wherever you're at in your depression if you resonated with the girl in the beginning of this video, and we can talk more about that in depth. And I just hope you found something helpful in this, and I will see you next time from the void.